We're going to be exploring a rather hot topic this morning. It's in some ways what we've been building to all weekend. And the question is, are Jews white? Now, don't answer instantly. At one point, of course, we understand that Jews are targeted by white supremacists for exclusion and sometimes for violence. And we know that Christian nationalism excludes the Jews with a kind of white supremacist ideology. But we also know historically that Jews were eligible for the GI Bill. They were eligible for white housing after restrictive covenants against Jews were outlawed by a Supreme Court decision. Interesting side note on that, when the Supreme Court made their decision, a couple of the justices actually had to recuse themselves from the decision because they themselves had homes with restrictive covenants that prevented Jews from purchasing the home in perpetuity. And so they had a self-interest and had to not judge on the question. That's how pervasive it was at that time. But that was removed in the 1940s. And when it comes to dealing with bank loans, dealing with the police, dealing with the criminal justice system, by and large, Jews have been treated as white, whatever they might be genetically. Visually in America, many Jews have been accepted as white. Of course, the assumption behind the debatableness of the question that are Jews white is something worth arguing over, has to do with the fact that people assume that all American Jews look European. You see, no one's debating whether Barack Obama was white or not because of visual appearance. But many American Jews, quote, look white. And so the question is, are they white? But as we've hopefully learned through this weekend's learning, the reality is that there's been a long history of Jews not all looking like Europeans. And in fact, this has been a product of centuries of Jews marrying with other populations. Intermarriage and Jewish, quote, racial mixing has been a long-time feature of the Jewish people all over the world. We talked about the difference between an exile, where you're in a bubble and living distance from your homeland and hoping to return at all costs and at any time possible, and a diaspora, where you spread out and you spread your roots and you become part of the soil of the new place which you are living in. Diaspora coming from the Greek for spreading of seeds. So in a diaspora model, Jews moved, they married with the local population. Whether or not there was formal conversion, we don't really know all the details. But the end result of that is that Yemeni Jews look different from Syrian Jews, and Syrian Jews look different from Polish Jews, and Polish Jews look different from Indian Jews in India, and those Jews look different from Moroccan Jews in North Africa. If we learn anything over this weekend, it's that there is no one way to look Jewish or one pedigree to be Jewish. We've tried to get beyond our Ashkenormative assumptions, assuming that everybody has an Ashkenazi background with Ashkenazi food and a connection to Yiddish, and the old country being Eastern Europe. With that complexity of Jewish identity, hopefully, also comes an openness to the new kind of Jewish diversity being created through our modern versions of intermarriage and conversion, adoption into the Jewish family, and this rediscovery of old Jewish diversity. We hoped when we scheduled this seminar and chose this topic, will open up a conversation on the new Jewish diversity and how we can make our communities more open and welcoming to the variety of people who are part of our communities. After all, we're entering into Passover season, and there's a famous line describing the Exodus that claims that when the Jews left Egypt, an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude, left Egypt with them. So on some level, there have always been a variety of Jews involved in the Jewish people with a variety of racial identities and ethnic backgrounds, even as they choose an identity with Jewish peoplehood. There's even the episode where Moses's wife is complained about by Aaron and Miriam, who say that she is a Cushite. And we'll see what Cushite means in our session this morning. So the fact that her skin may have been darker might have been a point of controversy, even in that part of the narrative. And of course, that reflects the ideology and values of later generations. Similarly, in the Song of Songs, narrator of that song at one point says, "I am dark but beautiful." And so even there, whether it's darkness from the sun burning her or darkness from her different ethnic and sort of melanin-based background, this question of light and dark and the Jewish racial diversity goes back to the Judean period, even before we were dispersed into Europe and again acquired our lighter skin through that mixing of populations. So we began our program this weekend on Friday night exploring the question of diversity in community and asking questions like, can we broaden our perspective beyond the Ashken normative assumptions? And can we connect with Jewish heritages that are not part of our own personal lineage? If we don't happen to have ancestors who lived in Yemen or in Ethiopia or in Morocco, can we still connect with those varieties of Jewish culture that other branches, extended branches of our family have created? Can we connect to our distant cousins and find ways to use their cultural creativity in the umbrella of Jewish civilization to enrich our approach to Jewish identity going forward? And are we allowed to use them? Is it cultural appropriation or is it a connection with a distant part of our family? And most importantly, can we ourselves create new traditions in the spirit of fusion cuisine, where we draw on our surrounding culture and also our inherited Jewish culture to create something new? And as we learned over the course of our sessions yesterday, that in fact has always been a part of Jewish tradition. Innovation is a deep part of Jewish culture. We started Saturday morning by exploring the question of what does it mean to be Jewish? And we found that actually it's a melange, a cholent, a stew of a religious identity, because after all, one converts to join this. Judaism is accepted as one of the world's great religions. At the same time, it's also an ethnic identity because you are born into it. And we use phrases all the time of being a member of the tribe. For some people, it is a racial, biological identity that goes back to genetics, and they go to 23andMe, they do genetic testing. John even mentioned before our session, and I call back to a question from an earlier program about the Jews, the group in Japan that claimed to be of Jewish ancestry and one of the lost tribes of Israel. And there are many of these groups that claim to be the lost 10 tribes of Israel. In fact, there's probably 100 groups that claim to be the 10 tribes. And some people have tried to test genetically to prove whether it's true or not. But as I commented earlier before we formally started the session, from a secular humanistic Jewish perspective, if we accept self-identification as opening the doors to membership in the Jewish people, then whether or not their genes prove they have Jewish ancestry is a question for historians. But whether or not they themselves are welcome to identify as part of the Jewish people is a moot point. They are part of the Jewish people by self-identification from our philosophic perspective, and therefore they should be welcome in our communities and welcome to be part of the broad umbrella of the Jewish family. We turned to ancient history and looked at the experience of Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt, and more importantly, their exposure to Hellenistic culture, as in some ways one of the first challenges of trying to bridge the modern world in a more secular vein, and as Hellenistic culture could be, and our inheritance of Jewish tradition, including traditional Jewish religion. And we saw in the case of Elisha ben Avuya, the heretic rabbi, how the attractions of Greek culture could sometimes pull you beyond the bounds of what the Jewish community was then ready to accept, even if his dialogue with Rabbi Meir at the end of his life opened up maybe the possibility of a different model of Jewish pluralism, learning from each other rather than Jewish plurality of living next to each other side by side. And then yesterday in the afternoon, we turned to looking at the experience of the Jews of Baghdad, which are part of the Mizrahi or Eastern Jewish diaspora, and also the Jews of Salonika, which is today Thessaloniki, which were also living under Islam for many centuries, but had a very different Jewish background, coming originally from Spain and speaking Ladino into the modern period and even into today. We saw the Jews of Baghdad, having lived under Islam, had acquired a kind of private Jewish identity and nondescript synagogues on the outside, beautifully ornate on the inside, to conform to the provisions of the rules of living as a Jew under a Muslim empire and under the banner of Islam, so to speak. And we also learned about how deep the roots of that community went back to the First exile from Jerusalem around 586 BCE, all the way into the modern period, and how tragically it ended after the founding of the State of Israel. There was a massive riot during the Second World War where Jews were blamed and scapegoated as tools of the colonialist British. And ultimately, in 1949, 50 to 51, the vast majority of Iraqi Jews had to leave. But they brought with them their attachments to an Arabic style of Hebrew. We heard an example of their beautiful music, and also that legacy of having lived with a foot in the Arab world and a foot in the Jewish world, which opens up new possibilities for us, whether it comes to cuisine or music, art, creativity, and a sense of our own history as the Jewish people. And finally, we wrapped up with our discussion of the Jews of Salonika, which was a fantastic experience of Jewish, if not majority, then certainly plurality culture, where at their peak, Jews were up to 50% of the population of this multi-ethnic city, divided among Greek Orthodox Christians, Turkish Muslims, and the Sephardic Jews, speaking Ladino. They were so much in charge of certain parts of the economy, in fact, that the port of Salonika was closed on Shabbat because all the warehouses were closed and all the porters and schleppers and longshoremen were Jews who were not willing to work on the Sabbath. Again, it's a very different experience to think of Jewish beggars and Jewish longshoremen and Jewish fishermen, but that was the experience of the Jews in Salonika, where they occupied many strata of society. In fact, there's an anecdote that David Ben-Gurion, who would become the sort of founding father of the state of Israel and its first prime minister, was inspired to see Zionism as a realistic possibility when on his way to the land of Israel from the Russian Empire, he landed in Salonika and saw what it was like to have a Jewish culture as a predominant influence on society. And he saw that this was hopefully the future of the Jewish state he was working to build. So we had a chance also to see the end of that Sephardic Jewish community, the tragedies of the Great Fire of 1917, the complexities of population transfers between Muslims and Christians that turned the Jews from the largest and most powerful group in a multi-ethnic city to a single minority, where the Turks left in a population exchange and hundreds of thousands of Christian Greeks moved in. And so the Jews went from being 47% of the population to being 25% of the population, and in a very different context where now Hellenistic culture was predominant. And then finally, of course, the experience of the Holocaust in the 1940s led to the deportation of 45,000 Jews from that community, and only about 4% of them survived 2 years worth of Holocaust persecution in Auschwitz and elsewhere. And so when you go to visit Salonika today, it's a battle over memory, but not a battle over lived cultural community, because today from 50% of the community, Jews are now 0.25% of Greece's second largest city. And while Ladino culture continues to create in new ways, we heard some examples of new Ladino music being made even today. We understand that they are a fraction of the population they were, and Salonika itself as a city is no longer what it once was. So today we're turning to look at a different example of a Jewish community, and especially a non-white, clearly non-white Jewish community. The Jews of Salonika probably would have qualified as European/white. The Jews of Baghdad may have not, depended on where they were. After all, even in America, the question of the status of Arabs, are they white or are they non-white? Are they people of color or not? That's often a debatable issue. And so the question of Arab Jews, Jews exposed to Arab culture, would have been a similar kind of debate. But the Jews of Ethiopia are clearly Jews of color, and they raise some of the same kind of questions of racial identity, of racism even, that we deal with in America in the lines between Black and white. Some people think of Jews of color exclusively as recent converts, people who were exposed to Jewishness and found it to be compelling, or wanted to go back to the original sources of Christianity and become sort of an Ur-Christian by exploring their Jewishness. There's also sort of radical offshoots, a group called the Black Hebrews, for example, which actually has some rather anti-Semitic perspectives and claim that the only true Jews are Black Hebrews and all the other Jews are imposters. And of course, there are also the children of intermarriage, or the children of adoption by Jewish families, who may have outward features that identify them racially as a person of color. And so they may identify as both Jewish and a person of color. And so we think of this as a recent phenomenon, whether it's converts or people identifying as Jewish or simply the children of interracial marriage. But the reality is that some communities of Jews of color go back for many, many centuries. And the community we'll be talking about today, which refers to itself as the Beta Yisrael, in fact, go back centuries and even have changed their names over time. At one time, they were called the Falashas. In fact, if you look them up in the old Jewish Encyclopedia, which was published in the 1970s, what you see are the name Falasha. And the name Falasha, or Falashmura sometimes, as we'll hear, it's a slightly different group, it means exiles. And it's kind of an insulting name. It's sort of like we used to call those Jews who converted to Christianity in the pre and post-Inquisition period in Spain and Portugal. We used to call them Marranos. But that was the epithet that other people threw at them, because Marrano in medieval Spanish meant pig. And so they were being called the pigs because they refused to eat pork. And it was a sign that they had been still secretly Jewish. So we don't really call the Falashas Falashas because that's an insulting name to them, just like we don't use the word gypsy anymore for the Roma people. What the community themselves prefer is Beta Israel, or Beta Yisrael, which means the house of Israel in their liturgical language, which is Ge'ez. And they actually have a couple different languages that they use. In speaking terms, they use either Tigrinya or Amharic, which are both Semitic languages like Arabic or Hebrew, but their liturgical language is Ge'ez. And actually they have that in common with the Ethiopian Christian church, which also uses Ge'ez as a liturgical language. In fact, the Talmud itself is written in Aramaic, and that is also a Semitic language. So when Jews moved first to the Persian Empire, they began speaking Aramaic, which was that international language there, because it was an easy bridge from Hebrew to Aramaic. That's why the Talmud is in Aramaic. And also it was an easy bridge from Aramaic to Arabic when the Arab empires began to spread. So too for the Beta Israel, when they emerged in history, they were already living in a Semitic context in Ethiopia where Semitic languages were predominant. And so they themselves had a Semitic language, though it wasn't Hebrew, it was something else. And their liturgical language, likewise, is from a different source, but still from part of that Semitic family. Now, where does this community come from? Well, that's sort of a complicated question. And as we were saying earlier, different communities will claim origin from the 10 tribes, but that doesn't necessarily make it so in a historical sense. Again, that doesn't disqualify them as Jewish from our perspective if they have some myths in their origin story. After all, every Jew has myths in their origin story, whether it's Abraham or the Exodus, from a secular humanistic perspective. Now, they claim descent from Solomon and his experience with the Queen of Sheba, as we'll see. But if you look at a map here, you'll notice that you have this territory surrounding the Red Sea. In the north, you have Israel with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip represented there. You have the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt. And then you have this coastal plain along Saudi Arabia, which is where you would find Mecca and Medina, those major cities we mentioned earlier in the history of Islam. And at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, you have Yemen, which was always known as a sort of spice Mecca, to use it metaphorically. And so there was a very popular spice trading route from the south of the Arabian Peninsula along Yemen all the way up the coast and into the land of Israel, from which you could go either to Africa or to Byzantium and Europe and so on, or farther into Asia. But you'll also notice at the bottom of the Red Sea here, you have this very short jump between Yemen to what is today Djibouti or Eritrea and Ethiopia proper. And this is where the Beta Israel find their roots geographically, is in the north and northwest of Ethiopia. And so when we ask the question of where did they come from, there are many possible answers. After all, they could have come from merchants and travelers along this spice route. They could have been an offshoot or a spread of Judaism from Yemeni Jews or from Egyptian Jews, by the way, who could have traveled down the Nile and made their way through Sudan into Ethiopia. They could have been an emergence out of the Ethiopic Orthodox Church. After all, that also uses its language Ge'ez as a liturgical language. And as we mentioned in other examples, they could have chosen Judaism as a "we are neither of you" in the ongoing battle between Islam and Christianity. This, by the way, happened in another kingdom, the kingdom of the Khazars in Central Asia, where they were caught between Christendom and Dar al-Islam, the community of Islam, and they opted for being Jewish to say, we're neutral. We don't want to get in between the two of you. So there are precedents for that too. Of course, some parts of the Beta Israel claim descent from a lost tribe of Israel. As I mentioned, there are, enough lost tribes to make up twice as many or 100 times as many as there were actually claimed in the biblical narrative of 10 lost tribes. Even so, they also claim descent from a famous story in the Hebrew Bible. Now, what the ancient name for Ethiopia is, again, we can't be entirely sure. In some cases, we might think it is Cush, and Cush actually has made its way into modern Hebrew. If someone is referred to as a Cushi or Cushite for feminine, it means a black person, but it's not a nice term. It'd be sort of as gauche as saying Negro today, where it has some technical validity, but also has a kind of offensive overlay to it in contemporary connotation. So don't refer to people as Kushim, as by that terminology. But Kush might have been an ancient term for Ethiopia, or this part of Africa that was south of Egypt, but still something that the Jews might have experienced via travelers or traders. But they might also have connected with another name, which is the name of Sheba. And this is a famous story in the Book of Kings describing the wisdom of Solomon. And so the Queen of Sheba heard of his fame. She came to test him with a great caravan with camels that bore spices and gold and precious stones. Again, you get this flavor of the spice trading routes going from Africa and from the south of Saudi Arabia and Yemen up the coast and into the land of Israel. There wasn't anything hidden from the king which he didn't tell her. He answered all her questions. And when she had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house he built, the food of his table, the sitting of his servants, and all of his officials, she said to the king, "It's a true report I heard in my land of your acts and your wisdom. I didn't believe it until I came and saw it. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame I have heard. Happy are your men." She gave the king 120 talents of gold, a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all of her desire, whatever she asked. In addition to that, what she gave her, and other gifts, she returned to her own land, she and her servants. And the speculation is the fetus she was gestating from Solomon's encounter. We know that Solomon was not shy about taking many wives, and the lusts of David are famous. So the claim is that there was a son that the Queen of Sheba bore from King Solomon when she returned to her land, and this becomes the ancestry of the connection of this community of the Beta Israel to the mainstream of Jewish tradition. Now, whether or not that's true, again, that's up for historians, geneticists to debate. But we definitely know that this is not a recent change. Before our session started, someone mentioned the Jews of Uganda, who again claim deep ancestry, but most likely converted in the late 19th, early 20th centuries for a variety of political reasons. But we know it's not that recent for the Jews of the Beta Israel. So here you have a testimony from a rabbi who lived and was prominent in Egypt in the late 15th, early 16th, through the middle of the 16th century. His name is David ibn Zimra, also known as the Radbaz by an acronym of his name. And you'll see his commentary mentions this group. Lo, the matter is well known. There are perpetual wars between the kings of Cush, remember that name for this territory, which has three kingdoms, part of which belong to the Ishmaelites, that means Islam, part of which belong to the Christians, and part of which to the Israelites from the tribe of Dan. That's one of those lost tribes. In all likelihood, they are from the sect of Sadok and Boethus, who are now called the Karaites. There are examples in rabbinic literature from the late Second Temple and early rabbinic period that describe a group that doesn't accept rabbinic law, that only does things the way they're written in the Bible. For example, the Bible says, you shall not kindle a fire on Shabbat, and therefore they would do Shabbat in the dark, whereas rabbinic practice was you could light a fire before Shabbat and you could allow it to continue to burn throughout the holiday. That's like the lighting of Shabbat candles that happens even today. So the Zadokites in that Second Temple, early rabbinic period claimed this. And then several centuries later, a new offshoot showed up called the Karaites. That was a product of a debate over the proper succession of the head of the Eastern diaspora based in Baghdad. Again, beyond the scope of our inquiry today, but you can find out more about the Karaites. They have their own interesting history. They also claim to go back to the written text of the Bible and not accept rabbinic teachings that branched off from it. So here, this rabbi is claiming this group based in Kush, in this land to the south of Egypt, may have a pedigree with this sect of the Zadokites or the Karaites from his own era, since they know only a few of the biblical commandments, but are unfamiliar with the oral law, with the Talmud, with rabbinic teachings, nor do they light the Sabbath candle. War does not cease from among them, and every day they take captives from one another. So here's a testimony to a variety of violent encounters between these different kingdoms, but also to the antiquity of a claim of this group in around the year 1500 to be Jewish and to have this descent from the tribe of Dan. There was also another example, legends that were shared by a man who traveled to Egypt around the 9th century, who referred to himself as Eldad the Danite. And he claimed to come from the tribe of Dan and follow practices that were off the mainstream of rabbinic practices. He may well have been an Ethiopian Beta Israel Jew migrating north, or someone who was at least familiar with that community, who was actually from Yemen or somewhere else. And this came up later on in a document that Radbaz had to write concerning the status of a Beta Israel slave. Remember, slavery was common in the Muslim world, actually into the modern period. There are still places today that have slavery, by the way. We shouldn't assume it's only a relic of the past. But the question was raised, what do we do if our slave comes from this Beta Israel community? Because there are different rules for handling a non-Jewish slave serving a Jewish household and a Jewish slave serving a Jewish household. So the question was raised, is a slave who claims to be from this community and who practices some parts of Judaism, but not other parts that we think of as Judaism, a la Rabbinic Judaism, what do we do with them? How do we treat them? And so the answer that Radbaz gave was, those Jews who come from the land of Cush are without doubt from the tribe of Dan. And since they do not have in their midst sages who are masters of the rabbinic tradition, they clung to the simple meaning of the scriptures, just the surface meaning of what's written in the Torah and the Bible. If they had been taught, however, they would not be irreverent toward the words of our sages. And so their status is comparable to a Jewish infant who had been taken captive by non-Jews. What that means is you don't blame them for not knowing or practicing rabbinic law because they didn't know any better. They were born Jewish with the pedigree, with the ethnos, but they weren't given the religious education and practice to know what to do. And so you sort of forgive them for their mistakes or their divergences from Jewish practice because they don't know any better. By the way, this is sometimes how Orthodox Jews today refer to Reform or secularized Jews, that they're just infants who don't know any better. So we'll forgive them. It's a kind of condescending way to approach different Jewish choices. It's not the pluralism we would aspire to, but it's a legal category that at least allows them to not condemn us as heretics. So I wouldn't be grateful for it, but it does exist. And he concludes by saying, if you say the matter is in doubt, even if you're not sure whether they're from the tribe of Dan or not, let's err on the side of generosity. And every 7 years, when it's a chance for them to become free, you give them the opportunity to become free because you treat them as Jewish enough for that purpose of getting out of slavery. So clearly there's testimony dating back several centuries to the existence and to the Jewishness of this particular group. So when we think about their religious practice of the Beta Israel, we have to realize that part of the divergence of who they are and what they do comes from their particular approach to Jewish scripture. We mentioned, we were discussing what do Jews have in common across the boundaries of all these diverse communities. One of the things they have in common is the Hebrew Bible, up to a point, because the Beta Israel have even a different canon of what counts as their scripture. Now, they sometimes refer to their religious practice or their Judaism as Heimanot. And you can, if you know any Hebrew, know the word emunah. Emunah means faith. And so Heimanot are their religious practices, their beliefs and rituals and scripture. So their canon is somewhat different from the mainstream rabbinic version. Here's a chart that tries to sort of describe what this is all about. So you have, for example, the core scripture, which they call the Orait, and sometimes in Aramaic, in rabbinic literature, you'd refer to the Oraita, which is the scriptures, meaning the Torah, the revealed text. But you'll notice that the Orait for the Beta Israel is actually larger than the classical rabbinical Torah. You have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the same 5 books of Moses you would find elsewhere. But you also have the books of Joshua and Judges and Ruth included in their sacred scripture. And in fact, their Oraita is 8 books written in a book form. Here you see a family who is donating a special heirloom copy of the sacred scriptures of this community. And you'll notice it's in a book form. It's not in a scroll form, as you would find a Torah in a rabbinic practice. Now, I will also mention there's another offshoot of the mainstream Jewish tradition called the Samaritans, and they have a 6-book Torah because theirs ends with Joshua. Again, it's beyond the scope of what we're doing today, but the Samaritans have a slightly different version of Torah too. Most Jews have a 5-book Torah, but the Beta Israel has this longer Oraita, which has 8 scriptural books in it. And then they have the rest of their canon, which includes some books we're familiar with, the rest of the classical rabbinical Tanakh, the Book of Kings, the Book of Samuel, Book of Psalms and Proverbs, Book of Job, Song of Songs, etc. There's some debate over whether they should include the Book of Lamentations. Again, I'll leave that for the specialists in the field to explore. But then we also have other known books that are part of their canon, but did not make it into the classical rabbinical canon. So books like the Wisdom of Syrax, sometimes called Ben Sira, the Book of Judith. Again, you can hear Yehudit, Judea, right? That root for that story. The Book of Tobit, the books of Esdras, and the books of Baruch, which are connected to the story of Jeremiah. Baruch is Jeremiah's scribe. The Book of Jubilees is included in the Beta Israel canon, and the Book of Enoch is included there as well. Now, I say these are other known books, not because they were known to historic Jewish communities. In fact, most of them were not. They were known to the rabbis who decided what books should be in the Hebrew Bible, but the rabbis chose to leave them out. They didn't include the books of Maccabees. They didn't include the Wisdom of Syrax, even though they knew it and they quote it occasionally in rabbinic literature. They chose not to include these books in their canon of what should be the sacred scriptures. But we know them from other sources. A few of them we actually know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, where when we found that trove that dates back to the 1st century of the Common Era and maybe a century or so before that, the library of this community based on the Dead Sea Scrolls community of Qumran, we found the Hebrew originals, or as best we know, the Hebrew originals for books like Jubilees and Enoch and some other of these earlier texts. Now, we had actually known something of Jubilees and Enoch from Christian versions, translated into Syriac and Ethiopic and other languages that certain offshoots of the mainstream Catholic and Orthodox Christian trends had preserved these books. And some of the books, by the way, were preserved in the mainstream Bibles. The Catholic Bible includes Tobit, includes Judith, includes the Wisdom of Ben Sira, includes the Book of Maccabees as another example. And as I mentioned, when we talked about Hellenistic Judaism, we ironically owe a debt to the Catholic and Orthodox churches for having saved some of these books that were written by Jewish people in the last century BCE and the 1st century of the Common Era. They were saved by the church because they testified to the time of Jesus, but it actually testifies to the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism and the end of the Second Temple period. So it's invaluable resources for understanding the emergence and the evolution of Jewish life. And what's fascinating about the Beta Israel is they included these texts in their canon. However, I have to highlight, if I didn't before, that the Orait, those first 8 books, are at a much higher level of holiness than the rest of their scriptures. Just like in mainstream rabbinic tradition, the Torah gets a lot more attention than the rest of the Nach, the prophets and the writings that make up the whole Hebrew canon or the Hebrew Bible. And then there are also some books in the 4th column that are part of the Beta Israel canon, but are unique to this community, that are not found in manuscript form or in references or in citations in any other sources. So the 3 books of Maccabean, which sounds like Maccabees, but actually has nothing to do with the other books of Maccabees, and the Testament of Abraham, the Testament of Isaac, the Testament of Jacob are all included in the Beta Israel extended canon, but not found in manuscript form or in translation in any other source as of yet. We could dig something up later that would change this chart, but as of now, this is what we know. And you'll notice also that this testament of Abraham and Isaac fall into an academic category called pseudepigrapha, where you ascribe the authorship, you claim that it was written by an ancient figure because they're more likely to read it if it was ascribed to Abraham or ascribed to Isaac and Jacob than if it was written by Joe Schmo or Ibrahim from the current neighborhood. That's less interesting than if Abraham wrote this book. So you ascribe the authorship pseudepigraphically, and then people are more likely to read it. So these are not written by the actual Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're claimed to go back to that. And we find other examples of pseudepigrapha in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient Jewish sources from that same time period. So maybe this is an argument for a claim that this community does have roots that go back to the Second Temple period because they have some of these books that date back to the Second Temple period and have reflections in other sources, whether in translation or in actual manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, they could also have been adopted from other versions of the church that kept these texts alive in translation, and that's how they wound up being part of the Beta Israel scriptures. They read them, they saw they were relevant to Jewish culture, and so they included them in their canon, even if they got them via Christian translation transmission, as opposed to an organic Jewish Masorah, a hand-me-down from generation to generation. And the last set of books I've included here are also part of the literature, the religious literature of the Beta Israel, but they're not quite at the level of the canon of pure scripture that are seen to be divinely revealed. They're important books, but not divinely revealed books. Think of the writings of Maimonides or the commentaries of Rashi, which are seen as not canonical in the same way as the scriptures, but very, very important and worthy of study. So you see some examples of the titles. You have the death of Aaron, the death of Moses, again, part of the pseudepigraphic adding to the traditional story, or almost a kind of midrashic explanation where you're adding to the story elements that weren't part of that originally. You've got a book of priests. You've got the precepts of Shabbat. You have an exploration of the meaning of creation. In some ways, the Zohar does this in a mystical way in the Mediterranean rabbinic tradition. You have this as well in the book called translated as "In the Beginning, God Created." So this is a flavor of the canon of the scriptures of Beta Israel, and you can also see an example of what the scripture looks like. You'll notice the alphabet is very different than the classical Hebrew alphabet. Perhaps you can see it a little better in this up-close version. You'll see one of their priests reading this. A kes is actually the term they use for their priest. And he's reading it with a yad, as we would do in a mainstream rabbinic version of reading scripture, but it's reading from a book in a bound version as opposed to the scroll that we're used to, and it's in the Amharic alphabet as opposed to in the Hebrew alphabet, which, as an aside, was originally the Aramaic alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet that started out of Canaanite looked very different. Again, the evolution of Jewish culture is a nonstop process. Now, what do we know about the ritual practices of the Beta Israel community? Well, in general, they follow biblical laws, but sometimes they don't follow rabbinic laws. So, for example, they have dietary rules about what animals they're allowed to eat, and those follow the rules as described in Leviticus and other sources in the Hebrew Bible. It includes a special kind of slaughter they do. Shechita is the rabbinic term for this. They have a special style of slaughter that drains blood from the animal, as rabbinic slaughter, ritual slaughter does. They also do not eat the sinew of the femoral vein, which goes back to the story in the Hebrew Bible of Jacob wrestling with an angel, and the angel touches his hip and dislocates it, and that's why Jews today don't eat a particular artery in the leg vein, and they follow that practice as well. But there are other parts that they diverge from rabbinic practice. So you may know that famous pronouncement of "do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk" was taken by the rabbis to mean do not have any dairy products with any meat products. And they even extended it to chicken, which could be confused for meat, even though chickens don't make milk. And it doesn't make sense in a literal way. Now, in the practice of the Beta Israel, they don't have traditional dishes that are like cheeseburgers or chicken parmesan, but they don't have as strict a separation. They do not boil a baby animal in its mother's milk. They wouldn't do that because that's explicitly prohibited. But they're not as strict on drawing the line. between dairy products and meat products. For example, in rabbinic practice, you have to wait 3 hours from eating meat till when you can eat dairy because they might mix in your stomach. The Ethiopians don't have that level of rigidity and sort of fencing around the Torah that the Talmud prescribed. They also do not eat raw meat, unlike other Ethiopians who will eat certain raw meat dishes. They always cook their meat. The Beta Israel have circumcision on the 8th day, again following the biblical pronouncement, although they may not follow all of the rabbinic expansions on those laws that were promulgated in the Talmud in the 500s, 600s of the Common Era. And they also maintain very strict purity laws, again following biblical practice of even a sort of physical segregation for women after childbirth, for example, where it's a little bit more flexible in rabbinic practices of nidah, or menstrual and postpartum impurity for women. So the reason why this is important is not only the interest of seeing a community doing Judaism differently, but also it gives the lie to a central rabbinic claim, which is that when Moses received the written Torah on Mount Sinai, he also received an oral Torah to go along with that written Torah. And that oral Torah was passed down word of mouth and hand by hand all the way through the generations, so that when the rabbis who were creating the Talmud began to write it down, first in the Mishnah around 200 CE, and then ultimately in the Talmud by 500-600 CE, they were simply recording this oral Torah that went back to Moses on Sinai. And sometimes when they were asked, where do we know this law from? Sometimes they quote a Bible verse, and sometimes they say, Halacha Moshe Sinai. It's a law that goes back to Moses on Sinai. But here we have a Jewish community that has the written text of the Torah and does not have the commentary, the explanations, the ritual practices of that oral Torah. If it had been handed down side by side, unified forever, that would not be the case. So perhaps their culture diverged away from rabbinic Judaism at an early phase before the Talmud was compiled, or perhaps it emerged at a later period. But one could have the written Torah without the oral Torah, even in a Semitic language, even in the Middle East, as opposed to far away in Asia or in the southern part of Africa. So this is the reality that this community gives us an argument as secular Jews, ironically, even though they themselves are a very religious community. They have a very strict observance of Shabbat. They do not light fires, as we mentioned earlier. You're not even allowed to leave your village or have sex. That's part of their prescription, where in rabbinic Judaism, it's actually a mitzvah for a married couple to have sex as part of the celebration of Shabbat. They also have additional celebrations they've added to their calendar. For example, on the 7th Shabbat after Passover, they have a special event, which is described in the Book of Jubilees. In fact, every 7th Shabbat, they have a special observance. That's part of that Jubilee calendar that was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, not part of mainstream rabbinic Judaism. Their version of Shavuot, which we celebrate 50 days after the beginning of Passover, according to rabbinic calculation, they celebrate 50 days after the end of Passover. Their calendar is somewhat different. Their leap months are not every 2 to 3 years or 9 out of every 17 years, as it is in the rabbinic calendar. Their leap years are an extra leap month every 4th year. And that's how they try to keep the calendar connected. They have a fast of Esther occurring around the same time of year, but they don't really have an active, vibrant, celebratory Purim event. They don't celebrate Hanukkah. That was, again, something that was not in the Bible. Remember, that's happening post-biblical canon being written. And so they don't celebrate Hanukkah in any meaningful way, unless they've adopted it if they've become part of the mainstream Orthodox Jewish community after their move to Israel. And their special holiday that was unique to this community for a long time was Sigd, S-I-G-D, which celebrates receiving the Torah 50 days after Yom Kippur. And actually, it's now an Israeli state holiday since, I think, 2008, as a way to recognize the importance of this community. But that was a unique celebration for this community that other Jews didn't celebrate. Again, suggesting that maybe the claim that everyone agrees on when the Torah was given is not a universal truth. So they don't have a Talmud in the same way that the mainstream Orthodox rabbinic tradition does, but they certainly have some similar traditions to what the Talmud has based on their own writings and practices. After all, when you're discussing the text and you have to clarify what counts as a murder and what counts as manslaughter, you may wind up with similar conclusions when you're debating from the same original source texts. They have some interesting clergy choices as well. They don't have rabbis, or the term rabbi, in their community. They do still have a kind of kahen or kes, a priest, that are part of their ritual practice, where in Rabbinic Judaism, the Kohens, the priests, don't have a lot of ritual performances. They have a particular blessing. They often get the first Aliyah Torah reading in a service in a synagogue. You may go to a priest for redemption of the firstborn son, but really it's a minimal clergy role. It's not the case at all in the Beta Israel. Their priests are very actively involved in leading services and claiming descent from Aaron. They also have something called a Debtara, which is a priest in training. This is someone who sort of works as an intermediary between the people and the priests, but also is sort of an intermediary stage on the stage of on the path to becoming a priest. Sort of like you had the Levites, who were the administrators of the temple at a level below the Kohens, the priests, when there was a temple in Jerusalem. They also have an interesting and unusual phenomenon, a tradition of celibate priests who are monks or even celibate nuns. And that's, again, not part of the mainstream Jewish tradition. You don't see that in other Jewish communities, but it is a core integral part of their clergy functioning, the idea of celibate, monastic, and nunnery convent like communities. Again, perhaps modeled on what you see in the Ethiopian Catholic and Ethiopian Orthodox churches. Maybe they saw monks and nuns and thought it would be a valuable addition to their community as well. When they refer to their synagogues, they use the term mesgid, M-E-S-G-I-D, and that's actually similar to the Islamic term a masjid, which is a mosque. And they both have roots in the Arabic/Semitic root for to prostrate oneself, to bow down. So where a Beit Knesset, a synagogue in Hebrew in the rabbinic tradition, is a house of meeting, a mesgid is a place of bowing, a place of prostration, because that's part of the ritual practice. So what I want to do now is share with you an example of the liturgical music of the Beta Israel community. It's about a 2-minute long video. And again, you'll see, just like we saw when we heard the cantor singing the Shema in an Arabic inflected version from a Mizrahi Jewish community, this will sound very different to you from what you're used to hearing, but this also should count as some variety of Jewish music. Okay, so you get a flavor from that of the liturgical music of this community. Again, it sounds rather different than we're used to hearing for Jewish music, but this also counts as Jewish music. Now, in terms of the history of the Beta Israel community, they endured centuries of persecution under both Christian and Muslim assault. Initially, of course, they were independent kingdoms, and eventually, over the course of time and numbers, they were conquered, sometimes by Islamic rulers, sometimes by Christian rulers. And in the end, they lost their independence and became sort of land renters, lessees. Sometimes the persecution would include forced conversions. So they actually have a community who are called the Falash Mura, which are of Jewish ancestry, but were part of a forced conversion experience like the conversos in the European experience that we're familiar with. In the end, this community maintained a rather strict isolation from the mainstream of Jewish tradition for many centuries. In fact, they might have thought at times they were the only Jews in the world that were left. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th into the early 20th century that the rabbinic Jewish world found them and decided to contact them and sometimes do outreach to them. And this actually leads to a very interesting dilemma, because should those outside rabbinic Jews who assume they have the correct Judaism impose their Jewishness on the Beta Israel style and say, well, when you do Purim, don't just fast, have a carnival and dress up in costumes and eat these foods and read the Megillah and have an event? Well, but that's not the Beta Israel tradition. And so what is the line between respecting their version of it and wanting them to be part of the mainstream of Jewish rabbinic tradition? There was an ongoing controversy into the 1970s over how Jewish the community was and were they in fact Jewish at all, especially vis-a-vis the law of return. Remember, early in its existence, Israel passed a law of return which put into a legal category this debate of who is a Jew or not. And the government had to decide who counts as a Jew. And we talked about the case of Brother Daniel, who had converted to Christianity, even though he knew he was born Jewish and claimed a kind of biological connection to Jewishness. This came up as well with the Beta Israel. Ultimately, one of the big leaps forward for them was in 1973, the Sephardi chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, who did a lot of things I would not support, but this one I do. He very strongly came out and said, they are Jews. They are from the line of Israel. They should be accepted as Jews. Ultimately, he got the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Shlomo Goren, to agree. Eventually, there was a resolution in the Knesset, in the parliament, that accepted this community as Jewish for the purpose of the law of return in 1977. However, into the 1980s, some of these Beta Israel Jews were required, if they wanted to be married by the Orthodox Central Chief Rabbinate, they were sometimes required to go through a kind of formal conversion by going to a mikveh ritual bath and having a ritual reenactment of circumcision, even though they were circumcised on the 8th day. But it wasn't done under a rabbinic style ceremony. And so the Orthodox establishment wanted them to do a pro forma conversion so that they could be fully accepted as Jews. And that was insulting to them, who claimed Jewish ancestry going back centuries with a well-documented tradition, even if it wasn't the mainstream rabbinic tradition. And so this led to some resentment, where even if you're willing to accept us as refugees, you're not willing to accept our Jewishness. That was a barrier between mainstream Israeli society, certainly the Orthodox Israeli community, and these Beta Israel Jews. Most of the community today, almost all of it now, lives in the land of Israel. And this was the result of two massive waves of aliyah, of immigration to Israel, that took place about 30 years ago. There was Operation Moses, which happened in 1984, and Operation Solomon in 1991. There were small groups who started to migrate in before even 1975, which is what raised the issues that they were debating over how Jewish is this community. And there were smaller operations along the way in between. In the end, about 14,000 Jews came in the big waves in each of those Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, plus the regular trickle of people sneaking in or sneaking out. Today, there's about 144,000 of the Beta Israel in Israel. About 35,000 of them were born there. And so they're native Israeli, being raised speaking Hebrew. But the community had a lot of challenges integrating to Israeli society. Remember, they came from a agricultural or a pastoral nomadic setting. They weren't used to a modern economy, modern jobs and businesses, even modern conveniences. Many of them, before they came to Israel, had never used electricity, had never used flush toilets, had never seen a TV, had never used an elevator. And many of them were illiterate. You know, the priests were the ones who learned to read the scriptures, but the masses of people didn't necessarily learn. The ideal of universal male literacy that was common in rabbinic Judaism was not necessarily a prominent value in the Beta Israel community. And if you're illiterate in your own language, how much more so is it going to be hard for you to learn to read Hebrew or to speak modern Hebrew? And that also leads to a limitation in economic opportunities and social opportunities. So learning Hebrew language, learning the cultural norms of Israeli society took a long time. And there was definitely some kinds of racial prejudice. Just as we heard about discrimination against the Mizrahi Jews and the North African Jews, that was their experience in the late 40s, early 50s, even into the 1960s. By the way, they actually had a version they called the Black Panthers in Israel, but they were Mizrahi Jews and Mughrabi Jews from North Africa who were fighting back against the hegemony of the Ashkenazi Jews. And so too, these kind of problems cropped up in the experience of the Ethiopian Jews. Famously, there was a practice of the Magen David Adom, the Israeli version of the Red Cross, because they wouldn't call it a cross, they made it a Jewish Star of David. So the Red Star of David, or the Magen David Adom, would take blood donations from the Ethiopian Jewish community and automatically throw them out because they assumed they were contaminated with either AIDS or a variety of hepatitis or some other contaminant. And this only became public in 1996 with a news report that led to the firing of the head of the Magen David Adom. And so that was, again, a phenomenon of the racist assumptions of the Ashkenormative Israeli society. Again, the Jewishness of this community is periodically questioned by those, what I call ethnic bouncers, who want to keep them out. And that's important if you want to get married by the rabbinic establishment or you want to be buried in a government cemetery. You need to have your Jewishness accepted. This, of course, is also a problem for people from the Russian Jewish Aliyah, and children of intermarriage can sometimes have that challenge too. And there's even versions of racism that we would recognize from the American experience. Complaints about police mistreatment, including of Jewish soldiers who are on leave, but are not treated with the respect that white Israeli Jewish soldiers are. The opportunities for employment are limited. Housing issues sometimes come in for discrimination questions as well. For example, in 2005, a mayor refused to settle more of the Beta Israel in his community because he was worried they would bring crime with them or the property values would go down. Sound familiar to the kind of dynamics around white flight and Black exclusion from white suburbs that we've experienced in America? Well, same kind of dynamics take place in Israel as well. Some of this community are now part of the Orthodox mainstream, and you'll see them with kippot and more conventional Jewish religious practices, while they also have some of their traditional kesim, their priests who practice the traditional Beta Israel style religion. Some of them are actually employed by the government. I think there's 60 or so kesim who are government employees, so there's some recognition. However, they're still not authorized to perform legal weddings. That has to go through the Orthodox rabbinic style rabbinate. So I want to conclude with a short, few minute long sort of survey documentary that talks in a bit more detail about the experience of the Beta Israel as they came to Israel. And then we'll open up for some comments. I'll look at what's in the chat and any other Q&A topics before we turn to our closing session to connect all the dots.
From Africa to Israel, these incredible people have come a long way. My name is India, and today we are going to meet the Ethiopian Jews of Israel. You may have heard of the Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, or the Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East. But have you heard of the Ethiopian Jews? The Jews of Ethiopia are known as Beta Israel. Most Ethiopian Jews first came to Israel under two major military rescue operations in the 1980s and 90s. They were called Operation Moses and Operation Solomon. In fact, Netflix even released a film called The Red Sea Diving Resort, based specifically on Operation Moses. Under Israeli law of return, every Jew has the right to come to Israel as an immigrant. This is called making aliyah. So the mission of these military operations was to airlift as many Ethiopian Jews to Israel as possible, to help them make aliyah. With Jews facing major persecution in Ethiopia and in the war-torn Sudan at the time, it was no easy task. But thankfully, many of them made it to Israel. And today, there are around 160,000 Ethiopian Jews in the country. They make up 1.7% of Israel's population. It may be a small portion, but their impact on Israeli society is quite large. They are involved in politics, they serve in the army, and they have a big influence on Israeli pop culture. In 2013, Titi Ayanau, an Ethiopian Jew, won Miss Israel, making her the first Black Miss Israel ever. And in 2020, Ethiopian singer Eden Alena was chosen to represent Israel in the Eurovision Song Contest. However, the Ethiopians of Israel have also had many struggles with discrimination, with poverty, and with the police. In July of 2019, a young Ethiopian Jew was shot and killed by a police officer. This incited many protests in Israel, similar to the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. But despite the many challenges they face as a community, the Ethiopian Jews hope to preserve their heritage and share their culture with the world. That's why in Kiryat Gat in southern Israel, there is this Beta Israel village. Here, they have mud buildings called godjos and plots of land for farming like they had in Ethiopia.
שלום, שמי גאולה הדראי, ואני גאה להיות יהודייה אתיופית. אז היום אנחנו נדבר על טקס בונה. בונה זה קפה אתיופי. זה לא רק לשתות, אלא באמת לכנס את המשפחה בתוך הבית.
The Ethiopians also have a passion for music and dance. It is still a huge part of their culture here in Israel. The Ethiopian Jews are brave people. Many of them escaped brutal persecution before coming to Israel, experiencing grief and the loss of family on their journey. Yet they remain resilient, even today, in their own struggles. The Ethiopian Jews carry a special joy in their heart, maybe because they are glad to be home. Their story should inspire us all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
So it's an overview of the community and their history. Interesting, they had this demo village in Israel to show what their life was like back in their homeland. Well, that's a complicated term. You know, is their homeland Ethiopia, where they lived for centuries? Is their homeland Israel, where they've lived for 40 years with particular challenges? Well, you know, this is the complication of diaspora. Sometimes you put down your roots where you're from in an immediate sense, and that becomes your home. And the concept of a homeland and a diaspora is an ongoing conversation in the Jewish world that I think is complicated by these varieties of Jewish communities, but I think also enriched by it, by seeing their experiences and how they became part of their environment and yet maintained a sense of global Jewish peoplehood. So I want to take a quick look at the chat and see what we have left. Let's see, a recommendation of a book. That's great. Someone comments that Rastafarians trace their new Jesus as evolving from that union of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Again, a claim to ancient pedigree that gives you also an African root and racial identity. So again, there's a lot of very interesting and creative sources for claims of Jewish pedigree and claims of Jewish identity. Again, if peoplehood, which is our ideal today in many branches of the Jewish world, is a kind of ascribed identity, you know, being part of the American people is an identity you adopt. You claim your founding fathers, even if you're not descended from the Mayflower, using land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's Pride, even if your fathers died in Syria or in Ethiopia or in Africa or on a slave ship crossing the sea. So the reality is that America is a claimed identity of peoplehood, and so too, on some level, Jewish peoplehood is a claimed identity, which would welcome us. Someone's asking about the numbers of Ethiopian Jews in Israel. It just depends on how you're counting them. You know, one other question you can ask is, if someone has an Ethiopian Jewish parent and a Mizrahi Jewish parent, where do they fit in the demographics? Are they claimed by both communities? And so each one can look a little bit larger. That might be one of the sources of disagreement, or it could be the source I was quoting is from a couple years earlier than the source that they're quoting. This is one of those, you know, challenges in demographic. It's not going to be as precise as measuring the weather. And even the weather is not as precise as we'd like to think.